Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of Privacy Laws, where I, Donata Strang Skillroot, talk with amazing privacy professionals, and we have some laughs along the way as well. This podcast is brought to you by Termageddon, an auto updating privacy policy generator. Today, I'll be speaking with Michael Power about something that I've always wanted to have. And honestly, I'm jealous of the people who do have this, and that's privacy rights. Privacy rights are the cornerstones of how people keep control of their personal information and protect their privacy. So I'm very excited to talk about this today. My guest today is Michael Power, who's a lawyer and consultant working with public and private sector clients on Canadian corporate and privacy law issues. Michael has a wealth of expertise in regulatory compliance, privacy, security, data governance, and the use of AI. Prior to his current position, Michael was the Managing Director of Privacy at Valencia IAP Advisors Limited, the Vice President of Privacy and Security at eHealth Ontario, and the Deputy Director at the Chief Information Officer Branch at the Government of Canada. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today. You've had a really distinguished career in privacy. What sparked your interest in this area of law?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a guest. I'm very happy to be here. What sparked my interest in privacy, to be honest with you, and I'm perhaps telling tales out of school, I fell into it. Once upon a time, when I was with the federal government, with the Canadian Department of Justice, I was the coordinator of the Electronic Commerce Secretariat. Now, this was back in the mid 90s, so I'm dating myself a bit. And the very grandiose title, but it was really me, myself, and I was tasked to address legal issues related to the use of information technology to provide government services. So, in other words, e-government. And as part of that, I was the instructing solicitor on a piece of legislation called the Electronic Documents Act. And then one day, the instructing solicitor on the Personal Information Protection Act, Heather Black, she and I got called to the House Leader's office on Parliament Hill and were quickly informed that the Prime Minister had decided that the bills would be merged, and they would be merged that night in order to be presented into Parliament the next day. And I remember, Heather and I looking at each other and saying, "Sir, these are two different topics, not a good idea." And the House Leader looked at us and he said, "Do you want to take it up with the Prime Minister?" And we said, "No, no, thank you very much." So we left, went back, got the drafter. We shared the same drafter. And the last thing we had to do was and we spent the night basically taking two separate pieces of legislation and merging them. And the last thing we had to do was choose the name. So if you're wondering why the Canadian federal legislation is called the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, it was because it was the middle of the night. We were tired, and we just said, "We don't care what you call it." And the drafter just said, "I'll put an and in." So all of a sudden, for a guy who was working on information technology, e-government issues, I was quickly thrust into the privacy world because I had to know that other piece of legislation that had gotten attached to mine. And for Heather's credit, she had to do the same thing. I take a certain amount of pride that with the new legislation currently in the House of Commons in Canada, which does a massive update on Canadian federal privacy legislation, what they did is that they radically changed the personal information protection part in terms of structure and in terms of updating. And they didn't touch the piece of legislation that I helped create, which was the Electronic Documents Act. They just simply hived it off and parked it somewhere. So I do take a certain amount of pride in the fact that something I was involved in substantively has continued to survive some 30 odd years later. The Privacy Act, that obviously has to change with the times. Mm-hmm. So because of that, I got into and because it's intrinsically related to technology issues, that's how I wind up in the privacy business.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I went into private practice in 2000, went into big law, and started practicing in the privacy emerging technologies area. And aside from a brief stint in the health sector, I've been doing that now for almost 25 years.
So that must have been a really long night combining those two pieces of legislation together.
Well, we got over the shock of it. I think we were all sort of going, "What's in that other bit that I'm merging into? What do I have to learn about?" And I had to do more, certainly more than Heather did, but because the document stuff was really just making equivalencies from paper to electronic
Mm.
document. There were some legislative techniques at play there, but no, it was yeah. I think it was more the drafter, but we had to sit there and answer every question that the legislative drafter had. So I don't recall it, but being particularly stressful in the construction of the document. But we had to be there to answer the questions and think through the permutations and implications of doing that.
Hmm. Very interesting. So you worked as a lawyer and privacy expert in public and private sectors. Do you have any advice for law students or lawyers who are trying to choose between the two?
Oh, they're very different worlds. I divide the world into in terms of data protection. I divide it into three domains. One is obviously the public sector, the private sector, and for us in Canada, certainly, and for you in the United States, the health sector. And I've worked in all three. What I would tell a student today is that if you want to work on really interesting work for low pay, go into government, go into the public sector. And if you want to get paid, but the work is less interesting, go into the private sector. That's sort of been my experience.
That's a really interesting way to put that. I've never heard that before, but it definitely makes sense.
Well, in the public sector, you're dealing with a lot of policy issues,
Mhm.
and you if you don't like a rule in the public sector, you can change it. I mean, often it's hard. Sometimes, depending upon the politics of the situation, it may not be doable at that particular moment in time. But when you're in government, you take a longer term view of the world. In my experience, governments do anyway. And so, if you don't like something, you can change the law or the regulation. And that you have to then think through all the, as I mentioned earlier, all the combinations, all the permutations. If you do X, it's almost like an algorithm. If you do X, ABC will come out. If you do
Yeah.
Y, DEF will come out. And because of that, it's much more intellectually interesting. It's much more exciting. It's much more cutting edge because you're dealing
Mhm.
with policy issues of the day. When you're in private sector, unless you're in sort of like a government relations kind of practice, I'm speaking more as a solicitor here rather than a barrister or a litigator. You find yourself in more in a compliance world, more in a dealing with regulations, interpreting them for clients, educating clients. So it's less for me, and I have to throw in that big qualifier. Certainly for me, and the person that I have evolved to be, I find that less interesting. I'm lucky enough that I'm senior enough that what I'll often get now is I will have, because I have a mix of clients in both the public and private sector, I will have public sector clients come to me and ask me those very cutting edge kinds of questions. We're thinking of X, we're trying to interpret Y. Give us your opinion on this. So I get to play in both spaces.
Mhm.
So I've been fortunate throughout a lot of my career in being able to do stuff like that.
That's fun. Yeah, changing legislation is so satisfying. So I had a very small experience with this, obviously not comparing the two in any sense whatsoever, but I live in Chicago in unincorporated DuPage County. And my husband and I got some chickens, and one of our neighbors complained. And the county came here and said, "Hey, turns out it's illegal to keep chickens here. You either get rid of these or you're paying like $500 per chicken per day in a fine." And to me, that was, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not getting rid of my chickens. So I worked with a group called Sustain DuPage, and we actually got the law changed in our county to allow for chickens. And now, like, a whole bunch of our neighbors have chickens. And it was like one of the most satisfying things I've ever done in my life, where, it's something so small. It only affects like a few people here and there. Nobody really cares about it as much. But it's really nice to, see our neighbors have chickens now and everybody just being able to do that and it being allowed.
I think so. I think for young lawyers and law students, probably now I should qualify this. I know people can't see me, but I am of a certain vintage. This year, 2024, marks will be in June, my 40th anniversary as a member of the bar, as a lawyer.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. And still going strong. But when I look back 40 years ago, the world has changed a lot. And I think, for if I had to give advice to law students or young lawyers, I would say, change is the constant. Once you get out there practicing, whatever sector you're in, things change, and be prepared for things to change and accept change. The only constant is change of
Yes,
any kind. You know.
absolutely.
So,
So now that you're in private practice, what types of clients do you work with and where can clients find you?
oh, I have a mix of clients. I would say they would be some of them are public sector, some of them are private sector. I have, as you mentioned earlier, I have two practices. I have a law practice and a consulting practice. Both are defined because my insurers insist that they be defined as separate and distinct, and they are. And so, and clients, depending upon what they want, they will hire me as a lawyer or they will hire me as a consultant. And so, in my own mind, I don't distinguish between the types of clients I have. I distinguish between how I build them and the type of deliverable that I provide to them. So, in terms of both my practices, I have a mix of what I would characterize as certainly public sector clients. These are departments, institutions, if you want to use the parlance here in Canada, at both the federal and provincial level. I have private sector clients. They tend to be larger. And on occasion, I have health sector clients because of A, my experience in the health sector,
Mhm.
and B, just simply the nature of the kinds of work that I do. I tend to deal with more emerging technology issues. I've throughout my career, I've done big law. I've done, in-house. I've been the owner of you know, a, a consulting practice, with, a number of employees. So I've had a variety of experiences. Now I'm a sole practitioner with a very, how would I characterize it, discrete practice, where the people who have tricky technical questions come to me and they're looking for not only the legal answer, but the solution to whatever problem they have. They can reach me. I have a website. I don't think I've updated my website in years. That's when I find time. I think that's one of my on my list of things to do. But I'm readily accessible through LinkedIn. I do have a website, power.ca, and people can contact me through that. But
Awesome.
that's how that's how I'm rolling these days. So
Well, that's great. So let's talk about privacy rights. Living in Canada, you have those and I don't. Living in Illinois, I only have the right to protect my biometric information, which, doesn't come up frequently. So, why are privacy rights important to people and what do they aim to achieve?
I think one of the things that I would say is that I make a distinction between personal information protection, or to use the European term, data protection and privacy. Certainly in Canada, we have both federal and provincial legislation. We have federal legislation which covers most of the country, including the largest province, Ontario. I'm in Toronto, so PETA, as the law is called now, until it changes, is the law of the land here. But in Quebec, British Columbia and Alberta, vis-a-vis the private sector. There are provincial statutes that are
Mhm.
characterized as substantially similar in nature. And these statutes provide certain rights to individuals, not a lot when you compare them to what you have under GDPR in Europe, but certainly where if you live in a state without any kind of data protection law, certainly more than what you would receive in Illinois.
Yeah.
Essentially here, as I said, the rights are, I don't want to characterize them as insignificant, but they are limited in the sense you have the right to access your information. You have the right to correct the information. You have, certainly in Quebec, you have the right to delete your information or have your information deleted. So you have the right to be forgotten, to use the European parlance. And you have a challenge mechanism in the sense that if you don't like the how your personal information is being treated, there is an enforcement mechanism that you can seek redress from. Under PIPEDA, it's the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, the Federal Privacy Commissioner. And the provinces, Quebec, Alberta, BC, have provincial, the equivalents of provincial privacy commissioners. So when you think in one hand about statutes, I think you have to think in terms of data protection laws. If you think in terms of constitutional law, certainly under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when you look at certainly Section 7, which concerns life, liberty, and security of the person, there are implicit privacy rights baked in there. And of course, we have Section 8, which is a right against unreasonable search and seizure, where the bulk of the constitutional privacy laws kick in primarily in a criminal law context, but can also happen in a regulatory law context.
So I think in the past, privacy rights or data protection was initially meant to protect individuals from intrusion by the government, right? So the unlawful search and seizure, wiretapping, all of these types of things. How have you seen this evolve to cover private institutions in the more recent memory?
Well, I think, and certainly in Canada, I think that there's a big caveat. We have, for public sector legislation, both at the federal and provincial levels, we have, freedom of information and protection of privacy statutes. At the
Mhm.
federal level, we call it the Privacy Act, and it is quite limited, and it hasn't changed since the 1980s. It was enacted roughly about the same time, just before I got called to the bar, and it hasn't really been changed. There's been some interpretation of it, but it has not kept pace with the changing world. When you look at the private sector, probably I would say that, the predecessor, the Privacy Directive, probably had more influence on Canadian legislators in determining the need to ensure international data flows. So because of the need for
Mhm.
sort of equivalency between regimes to facilitate data flows. What you have here is in Canada, there was a drive to enact privacy legislation more to, I want to use this word because it's not really appropriate, but it's the one that comes to mind, more to appease the EU uh,
Mhm.
than any kind of evolution of domestic privacy law from the Public Sector Privacy Act to the private sector legislation. And with the advent of the private sector legislation, what you saw was provincial governments. Then they moved in because of the sensitivity of the information. They used that law and the principles and the concepts found in that law and found in the GDPR, or the EU Data Protection Directive, I should say, as it then was, to craft personal information protection laws vis-a-vis health information. And all the provinces and territories in Canada have personal health information protection legislation. So it'd be like your HIPAA.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how privacy laws, data protection laws in Canada evolved. It wasn't from a, well, this is what we do in government, so we should do it for the private sector. It was more of a, this is what Europe is doing vis-a-vis the private sector and a little bit of the public sector. But because of our own constitutional arrangements, we can't really dictate to the public sector in the provinces So we'll create a private sector law, and then from that, you got into the health protection laws, health information protection laws.
Yeah. It's really interesting, at least to me, how much copying and pasting happens in the United States when it comes to privacy laws. So, one of the things that I do is I track privacy bills, right? So, I have seen instances in which one state proposes a privacy bill, and then another state takes the same exact text and then proposes it as their privacy bill, sometimes forgetting to switch out the name of the state or leaving blanks. Like, this law will apply to you if you collect blank number of data of a blank number of people, where, it seems like maybe a little bit more time should have been spent on the drafting. At least that's what I see in the US here.
Well, that goes to legislative drafting. You know,
Mhm.
a lot of times you kind of have to blame the staff in a particular politician's office for
Yeah.
that. But fundamentally, you do see if they were drafted correctly, you you would see. I think you would nonetheless see a lot of commonality, and that's because the fundamental principles behind these laws, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in Canada, or whether they're in Europe, there are a certain degree of universal principles that have evolved and have been translated into legislation. And that's because the wording might be different, the scope might be different, the application might be a little different,
Mhm.
but the substantive rules or requirements are often the same. They may vary, they may be tweaked a little bit, but the core idea is there. And now we're talking about, do we apply it all? Do we apply a little bit of it, a medium bit? So you're fine tuning the application of the legislation, but the core principles are there.
Yes. Or hopefully they're there.
Well, you would think. A lot of times, privacy is used to justify, doing something that isn't very private.
Mhm.
In some respects, it's very Orwellian.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. So let's talk about some rights specifically. So the right to access and portability, how does that help individuals?
Well, the right, I would characterize that as you cannot fix something you don't know about. And so, what will happen is that in order to determine whether or not there has been, when you think about let me back up a little bit and talk about the principles. So, in terms of limiting collection, limiting use, limiting disclosure, retention, if you have collected information about me and you have certain requirements to meet under legislation, under our PIPEDA, under any kind of privacy statute, in order to determine whether an organization or an institution is adhering to those requirements, you need some kind of mechanism to audit it. Yes, there may be an enforcement arm somewhere, but the best audit mechanism is yourself. If people have information about you and you want to ensure that they are processing or using that information correctly, you want to check up on them. And
Mhm.
that ability to check up is a right of access. Portability, that's a separate concept. It often gets lumped in with access, but essentially that means that if you want to move institutions, it's more a private sector concept, but if you want to move between organizations, you want to use a different bank, but you don't want to input all your information. What you want is that you want an ability to transfer it from one to the other. Works fine in theory, less so in practice. We've not quite had that kind of open standards that we need in order to have true portability. The one place where you might see that first would probably be the financial sector, certainly here in Canada.
Mhm.
Certainly they're working on it in Europe, but people talk less about portability and play and give it less attention and focus more on the ability to access, and especially in Europe, the ability to delete. In other words, have information removed from the record.
One of the things, like a concept that I heard a couple years back about portability that I found really interesting, and this isn't really in play right now, it doesn't work like that, but the idea is that platforms like Facebook have a lot of control over consumers because if you think about it, how difficult would it be to change from Facebook to another provider, right? Like you have all your pictures, you have all your posts, you have all your friends, you have all your interactions, and then you would lose all of that and have to start from scratch on another platform. And the idea was that portability would allow consumers to switch from these large platforms easier if we had true portability in the future.
That's true, but that's a portability question. And then I would say, how is that a privacy question? How is that you're now touching upon what I would characterize as the evolution of privacy concepts, because now what we're talking about is information governance and the
Mhm.
ability to have a greater degree of control over your information. That stems from privacy in the sense that when you privacy is a very hard concept to define. We've gotten away from that, trying to do that. We've got more into sort of a taxonomy approach to privacy ideas. Um, and even there's a debate about whether that's a good thing or not. But privacy, in essence, one concept of privacy is that it provides that when we have privacy, we have a greater degree of control over our own personal information. So, in
Mhm.
that sense, you could say, it's related to the portability issue, because now we're talking about, hey, they're my pictures and I want to move them somewhere else. So I want control over that information. But we're talking about a concept of now where it's become more about the information than about privacy, even though the concept of greater control originally originated in the privacy space because we didn't want information about ourselves being displayed publicly. But here we're talking about, in a weird way, and I put it in air quotes here, public information, because you're sharing it with the world.
Yeah.
It's not a privacy concept, it's more of an information governance concept. And you can see that because 50 years ago, privacy was about confidentiality. It was about keeping information about yourself out of the public domain. And
Mhm.
now what you see is that there's almost an evolution in that concept, in the sense that privacy is now about use, in that, well, yes, I may have given you my information, I may have put it out in the public, but I put it out for this reason, and you're using it for a different reason. And that I didn't consent to that, or I didn't approve of that. So you can see that what originated in the privacy world is now we're now talking more about information governance
Mhm.
and taking the concepts from a privacy world into an information governance world, which in a lot of ways is very appropriate today when we talk about certainly AI and the voracious appetite for data, not necessarily limited to personal information, but it becomes related to the concept of I want to control the information about me or related to me, and
Mhm.
that includes whether it's private information or public information.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think you can kind of mold these things together as well, depending on why somebody's seeking portability or a different right. So, if I just want to switch providers, that's different than I don't like the fact that Facebook uses my information for marketing or something like that. May depend on the individual and what purpose they're trying to achieve as well.
Well, that's true, and it's, as I mentioned, it's now our we're using privacy concepts as they were originally developed to apply. We're trying to put a square peg in a round hole, because we live in a world full of round holes. And so now you're seeing the concept of information, what I characterize as data governance, information governance concepts, are now being populated with privacy notions. So yeah.
Yeah, in the US, we have a lot of that of trying to adapt laws from the 1980s into the modern world and all these other things. And in the US, we're seeing more states pass laws that allow consumers to opt out of targeted advertising, opt out of sales of their personal information, opt out of profiling. Do you think that this is actually helpful or that an opt in approach would be much more helpful to individuals?
I think, that's a balancing of needs. And I know this is going to sound crazy, but certainly the Canadian federal law, it's designed to balance the interests of businesses that need information in order to thrive
Mhm.
and the ability of individuals to have some degree of control over their personal information. And I think we're struggling with that now. And I'll come back to your opt-in, opt-out question before soon. And what I find is that in my experience, people do not necessarily mind sharing information with an organization. So whether you have opt-in or opt-out doesn't matter. What we object to, what people object to, is that sharing of information between organizations. I might tell you something and I might bare my soul with you, but I'm doing it with you and I don't necessarily want you to turn around and share that information with other people.
Mhm.
So if I was just sharing with you, I could live with an opt out because I know that the information is only going to stay with you and I'm giving it to you willingly. But if we're now talking about you're going to share it with other people, you're going to sell it or even share it or whatever, and it's even I don't care if the company's related, it's somebody else and it's for a different purpose. And now I'm starting to be profiled. Then I would say, no, I think you should ask me for my permission to do that. In other words, there should
Mhm.
be an opt-in.
Yeah, the US is loving the opt-out approach right now, and I wonder how much of that is caused by lobbying and things like that. But, if I go onto a website and my information is being sold and then I have to opt out, 9 out of 10 individuals probably don't know where they should have opted out in the first place, like where they've put their information and who's selling it and who they're selling it to, so that it doesn't really truly help, I don't think.
No, I think now you're talking about the practical application of an opt-out mechanism, and most businesses do not get that right. And you have to keep in mind also, sometimes that opt-out or even opt-in can be annoying. Like just look at all the cookie
Mhm,
notices that you get every time you visit a website. You have to essentially you have to go through some of them, you have to go through a long list of uses and you have to, say, I don't agree with this. I'm opting out. And it's pain. It's just painful. So we have not had, businesses have not found an easy way to facilitate, to manage consent. Uh,
mhm,
and that's probably one of the challenges that both businesses and individuals face over the next few years is trying to figure out, how do I get to control that? I agree with you on the lobbying point, partly because that's how business is persuading the political sector to avoid opt-in requirements, to avoid stronger privacy laws, because they haven't quite figured out that where they want to be. Is it do we want to stop profiling? Do we want to stop the sharing of data, or do we want to stop the collection of data? And I think we
mhm,
need to figure out what is the practice that we want to what is really objectionable to us. And
yeah,
I suspect a lot of it would be the profiling stuff,
mhm.
the profiling aspect of it.
Yeah. So how would someone who's not a privacy lawyer figure out what privacy rights they have?
Well, certainly in the United States, the major primary vehicle would be the privacy policy.
Mhm,
Um, Unfortunately, those can be changed on a whim or as circumstances dictate. But there's if you want to inform yourself, if you want a degree of transparency as to the practices of the organization to whom you are giving your personal information, probably the privacy policy would be a starting point. In states where there are privacy laws, probably I would say look at the departments, the government departments that are in charge of administering those laws. The privacy laws are almost like consumer protection laws now,
yeah.
and so that would be another source of information to find out what your privacy rights are.
Yeah. It's hard, a lot of times when reading the privacy policy, they don't say who gets what rights. So it'll say, depending on where you reside, you may have the following privacy rights, and then the rights don't say like who they actually apply to. I think that can be very confusing to consumers. And I'm sure a lot of people have tried to exercise rights only to be told, well, you're not a resident of California, so you don't get anything.
Exactly. That comes back to that presentation, how to manage consent. How do you do that? You usually see one document that has different sections depending upon where you live, and you have to look at those sections. A lot of this documentation is regrettably written by lawyers. That can be a good thing and a bad thing. I'd rather have a lawyer write it than a marketer, because you need some degree of precision. But unfortunately, lawyers have to. We have a bad habit of wanting to be as precise as possible, which means that we tend to add a lot of words. As I've gotten, as I've discovered in my during the course of my long career, I edit things down more. I write less. I try to make it as short as possible and as plain language as possible. That's a function of, I think, about age and experience. But a lot of the documentation is unfortunately in legalese, and as I've discovered late in life, you need to balance the legalese with the precision required. So,
Yeah, I think it's really interesting of how much lawyers love to write. So when you were in high school or college, you would get a page minimum. So you'd say you need to write a paper that's at least 5 pages. When you were in law school, you had a page maximum.
mm.
So the maximum that your paper can be is 10 pages. So you don't write like 40.
Exactly, exactly. I spent one of the universities here in Toronto is York University, and it has a very distinguished law school, Osgoode Hall Law School. And they asked me to teach a privacy course, which I did, and it was a writing course. So to keep my life simple, it was always, they had to write a paper, and it was 100% of your mark. And it was a seminar class where most of the classes I introduced them to, basically it was a tutorial on privacy law, privacy concepts, all this sort of stuff. But I reserved one class about how to write a paper, and I would tell them, close your laptops, put your pens down. You don't need to take notes. You just have to listen to me. You have to listen to what I'm emphasizing, and I'm going to read something to you.
Mhm.
After the class, I will give it to you. That's why you don't have to take notes. And I will tell you how to write a paper, and more importantly, how to write a paper for me, because I am, judge, jury, and executioner when it comes to work. And the point of it, the whole exercise was to get them over that hurdle of, you know, legalese diarrhea,
Mhm.
to get them to write more shorter, more punchier papers. And I think the secret of success as a lawyer is to write well, and to
Yeah.
write with a lot less words.
I think so too. I think that's a lesson that a lot of us can learn from for sure. So, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today about privacy rights and about your career. For everyone listening, please make sure to subscribe to Privacy Laws so that you do not miss the next episode.
Well, thank you for having me.